Okay, so the second chapter in the Foundations of Data Visualization goes into the aesthetics. There's a lot of different choices that we have, including the how we're using the position of the data to tell the story, how we're using shape and size. Those three elements are typically associated with scatter plots, but you can see them in other places as well. Line width and line type are things that are, again, mostly associated with line graphs, but you can see them in other places too, if, at the very least, thinking about how shapes are outlined inside of your graphics. And of course, color is pretty much everywhere. So how do these map onto the different data types, and why does it matter to think about the data type? So the biggest thing is that the book didn't point out super clearly that I wanted to point out to you is the ordered versus the unordered, particularly looking at these categorical variables here. So for example, if we have something like dog, cat, and fish, it really doesn't matter what colors we're using for them, and you'll usually want to use colors that are boldly different from each other. So if you're thinking about like the color wheel, you can think about using like the 3 different position points on those. So like red, blue, and yellow type things, or twist that around, use complementary colors, making them very, very different from each other. So they're obviously not ordered. You'd want to use this for pie charts too, thinking about that. You don't want to have the colors like super related to each other. That's very different from something that is ordered, in which you use more of a gradation scale to show how they flow together. Yeah, so that kind of you can use those gradation ones for anything. Like the continuous numbers are really good for that. Discrete numbers also works. They are ordered, whether even if they don't use the integers or the decimals, and they're just the integers, they're still ordered, obviously, and so you can use that type of scale for those as well. Date and time are also ordered, so gradation type scales work well for those. Text is completely unordered, obviously, and you don't usually show them as like in visualizations in the same way, but if you were, then you'd want to treat them as unordered and make them distinctly different for the color choices. When we're thinking about those unordered ones and what to do with them, you need to be thinking about what order things should be ordered in. So, for example, the example in the book has this ordered by temperature chart, and the story that they're showing you is that Chicago has the lowest temperature. You can see that most plainly in the winter months of especially like November going into December, and January going back into March, right? And then Death Valley is the hottest. They've got the lightest colors here, and they don't get into the purple ranges over there. But if we're looking for our city, and this was a long list, maybe we'd rather have things ordered by city name because we want to search for that. But when you're looking at the temperatures themselves, like, it tells a very different story, right? So that's a very long way of saying it tells a very different story depending on how you order these. So here it's ordered alphabetically so we can find, I'm from San Diego, so I care about that. And here, coincidentally, these three are kind of ordered in the same order, just reversed. So I can still see clearly where San Diego fits in with like Houston, but Chicago is like way up here, and so these comparisons are less easy. So here I can compare between the cities very well, but not all have a hard time finding my city. So yeah, so these kind of ordering choices matter a lot, and this is something that's like in combination with the choice of how we're using this gradation scale. Now that's with two elements, with using the positioning and the color. Here we're adding in three elements at once, right? We've got the positioning, well, four elements actually. Yep, that's a mistake, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so that should actually be four pieces, because we have our we've got the position on the axes, we've got our colors, we've got our shapes, and we have our sizes. There we go, fixing it live. Yeah, which is a lot of information packed into one graphic, which makes these a little harder to read. So keeping that in mind, when you have a lot of information packed in, it's efficient, but it takes a lot more time for the user to process all the information. So we're reading just off the bat this fuel efficiency versus displacement. So if we're interested in just seeing the general trend, we can read just that, in that there's a negative relationship between the fuel efficiency and the displacement. Whatever the displacement actually means. I don't know anything about cars. We've got color is usually the first thing that kind of easily registers for people. So we've got this horsepower, which I'm guessing is horsepower. I don't see a quick thing telling me that it's horsepower, which you should always have that in there. So things to note, like this very light color, it's a little hard to see, isn't it? Because there's no outline around it. So they made a choice not to use line, so their width is 0. And if they had used a line, it'd actually be a lot easier to see this. They probably chose that because they're using size, and these tiny, tiny little elements here would be hard to see with the outlines. So they had to sacrifice one to make the choice for the other. You've got these different cylinder shapes that are pretty clear. These are ordered, but the shapes are not necessarily ordered, or maybe, you know, I mean, they are kind of ordered in that there's more points for the smaller cylinders. I don't know if that was intentional or not. But yeah, they're not really ordered shape sizes. They are ordered in their weights. And so things like weight does make sense to use size, because bigger is kind of heavier in the visualization. But yeah, so yeah, you can pack a lot of information in here, but there's so much in here that it can be a little hard to read. So this is probably like, you wouldn't really want to add much more into a chart, because it just puts such a burden on the users. Now this I pulled straight from the textbook. What are some things that could make this chart a little bit more good to go? personally, for me, putting a little bit more white space between the axis letterings here, the words and the numbers, just to give them a little bit more room is nice. Again, anything that has abbreviations should be spelled out somewhere for the random person like me who doesn't know that much about cars. So it's the visualization's understandable by anybody. And this is kind of a close-up on the data. Usually we do want the axes to go all the way to 0, just so that we're not giving a false sense of the data. On this one, it doesn't impact it too much because, you know, 10 is only here and then the 0 would only be here. So it's not a big distortion, but sometimes you can severely distort the data when you don't bring the axes out. So yeah, so things like that are things to keep in mind, and we'll get more into those when we hit these specific types of charts. Yeah, so just keeping in mind how all these elements play together, whether you're dealing with tables or with all these different types of charts. All right, so that's it for this chapter.